On this channel, during the latter half of 2024, I've made a fair few FNAF theories that dive deep into some of the long-standing mysteries of the series. What was FNAF 4? When does Sister Location take place? What was Midnight Motorist? So on and so forth. If you've watched those videos and are familiar with the topics I've talked about, you might realize there's something that definitely comes up a lot: the crying child from FNAF 4 and the Shadow Animatronics. Truth be told, that is mostly coincidence. Part of it is because I ended up talking about Happiest Day in FNAF 3 a lot. I swear today is a slightly different topic, and I can say with certainty I won't be focusing on those latter two topics. If you are a longtime viewer of the channel, or a watcher who keeps up with what I'm doing via the Discord server or my live streams, you might have noticed I actually took somewhat of a step back when it comes to FNAF. That was mostly for my own sanity, and so I didn't get immensely burnt out from doing FNAF content. Lately, I've been playing some other games, working on other projects, while still taking care of a 90-something-year-old child, aka my great-grandmother. Although it may not seem it, I have been busy. Some of the stuff I'm planning on doing I'm really excited for, such as some possible video essays I've thought about doing, because I realized I have a lot of thoughts and opinions regarding some other franchises and fandoms. Besides that, though, the reason I actually decided to make this video specifically is because I was inspired by two particular things. The first one is a video that recently came out that was made by the game Salmon, in which a licensed psychiatrist tried to accurately diagnose the main villain of the series, William Afton. The second source of inspiration was actually a totally different game that recently came out called Silent Hill 2. No, not the one from like 20 years ago. I mean the remake of that game that came out 20 years ago. Not to get too off track, but let's just say Silent Hill 2 is now in my top 5 games of all time. The story is peak, the acting is peak, the atmosphere and game world are peak. Just every aspect of this game is so immaculately peak that getting into it would require its own video. However, I will say, Silent Hill 2 is a very deep and thought-provoking game that made me think about a lot of different things. During my playthrough of the game, I had already decided that I wanted to make another FNAF video / theory soon, but admittedly I kind of struggled with what exactly I wanted that video to be. I could do another theory, of course. I had some thoughts about Into the Pit that I've been stewing with since the game came out. Then there was the week before, which certainly proposed a few things that I found worthy of note. Or I could even do another Fazbear Frights breakdown, which I know I definitely want to do eventually because it gives me an actual reason to sit down and read all those stories. But there was something that just didn't sit right with me when I dwelled on any of those options. It wasn't until I finally finished my playthrough of Silent Hill 2 that I realized what the issue I had was. God knows it's not a secret, but the FNAF theorizing community has been in a bit of a rough spot for the last few months now. Although many would argue it's been like this for a while, I would say over the past year, it's gotten a lot worse, and it wholly stems from the book canonicity debate. This singular subject has torn people asunder. It makes people immensely angry. It fuels people's hate and rage and despair. The one thing people want is clear and absolute clarity. But that is seldom what we're getting. Now, hopefully, Secret of the Mimic will finally end this debate once and for all. The worst possible case is that it muddies the waters even more than they already are, but the book debate itself isn't what I want to talk about today. My point is that I didn't want to make a theory or video that was supposed to be grandiose or somehow lore-altering, in that it's supposed to make you totally change the way you view a topic in the lore. God knows how much people get pissed off when they see "I solved FNAF" in the title of a video. There's a reason why I and many other content creators do that, but again, that's besides the point. I wanted to do something a bit different. I wanted to do a video that took a step back from the currently overwhelming and heated atmosphere of the fandom right now, and for a change, really just had a bit of fun. Is this technically a theory? For all intents and purposes, sure, but the intention here is not to seriously change your view on what we talk about today. Let me repeat that. I'm not going to try and sell you on what I'm talking about. Although one might be able to derive some sort of accuracy and sense from what we'll soon be discussing, that isn't the goal. This video was not made with the concept of being correct in mind. I'm not going to act like the claims I'll be making are factual or definitive, and none of this should actually be taken into consideration in regards to actually solving the mysteries of FNAF. If that's somehow disappointing to you, then I apologize in advance. However, that doesn't mean what we'll be talking about is any less interesting, at least in my opinion. At the very least, I think it'll be an interesting discussion and an intriguing deep dive into something that isn't usually touched on when it comes to FNAF theorizing. Today, we're going to be taking a page out of the Game Salmon's book, and we're going to try and apply some real psychology to our favorite Scary Pizza Bear franchise. Specifically, we're going to once again tackle the character of the crying child along with his connection to the Shadow Animatronics. Only this time, we'll look at it through the lens of a psychological breakdown. Now, I should preface that I am in no way a professional psychiatrist in any sense of the word. I am not an actual doctor, I am by no means a medical professional of any sort, and even more than when I said it before, you should not take what I say today to heart whatsoever. I did a good amount of research before writing this script, of course, but at the end of the day, I took 1 year of honor psychology in high school, and truth be told, I don't remember much of it. In this video, I will do my best to try and accurately describe and explain the complex topics I'll be talking about. But ultimately, this is my first time doing something like this, and a lot of this stuff really is complicated because it pertains to real-world concepts that real professionals would certainly have a better understanding of. Again, this is just for fun, so feel free to take what I say here with a grain of salt. If you are somehow much more involved or knowledgeable on these subjects, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below, or if I do get something wrong, feel free to correct me. If I end up getting a lot of stuff wrong, I'll probably make a pinned comment regarding it, but as it stands, I think, or at least hope, I've done a decent job with my research, and I think I'll be able to break this stuff down moderately well. With that out of the way, let me actually talk about what I mean by stuff. If you aren't familiar with psychology, then the name Carl Jung might not ring a bell in your head. Carl Jung was a psychiatrist, among other trists, that is regarded as a pioneering evolutionary theorist whose concepts and processes are still used and talked about to this day. It's Carl Jung's theory on the human mind that we'll be using / applying to FNAF of all things, or at least specific aspects and components of his theory that I have deemed worthwhile to apply to this Fazbear source material. Like I said before, a lot of what I'm about to explain is stuff that I've researched for this video. Some of it is basically from the sites and sources that I looked into during my research. For transparency, I'll be linking and marking what sites I went to in order to learn about a lot of these concepts. That said, let's talk about Carl Jung's model of the human psyche. The psyche to Carl Jung is the sum total of different processes, a system of multiple components, so to speak. Within this model, the key components of the psyche were the ego, the personal unconsciousness, and the collective unconsciousness. Starting off with the ego, it can be referred to as the conscious mind because of what the ego represents, that being our thoughts, our memories, our feelings, things that we are capable of being consciously aware of. The personal unconsciousness retains memories and experiences that a person may not be currently thinking of within their conscious mind, but it was at one point existing within the realm of the ego. For an example, picture the personal unconsciousness as if it were a pool, but instead of being filled with water, it's filled with things from our lifetime. But as you might have guessed, it's not easy for a human being to remember every little thing that happens on a daily basis. But it did still happen, and we went through that experience. We, as the flawed species that we are unable to retain every little thing that happens around us. With that in mind, that pool I mentioned is basically where our forgotten memories go. It's also where our unconscious awareness stores sensations or feelings and things that we might generally unconsciously sense. This includes repressed aspects of what we might think or feel. Quote, "Everything of which I know, but of which I'm not at the moment thinking, everything of which I was once conscious but have now forgotten, everything perceived by my senses but not noted by my conscious mind, everything which, involuntarily and without paying attention to, I feel, think, remember, want, and do, all the future things which are taking shape in me and will sometime come to consciousness, all this is the content of the unconscious." The Collected Works of Carl Jung, Volume 8. Now, as for the collective unconscious, this one we won't really be focusing on for this theory, but for the sake of explaining and clarification, Carl Jung believed that the collective unconscious holds a person's personality from birth and that a human's personality wasn't solely based on the environment someone grows up in, but that the environment helps bring out what is already there. Think of it like a blueprint, for example. Deep within our consciousness, certain aspects of who we grew up to be are already laid out and built into our psyches even as an infant. The world we grew up in simply helps refine our personalities. Also, to briefly clarify, Carl Jung believed that a person's personality was made up of universal archetypes and classified people as either introverts or extroverts. You can thank him for both of those terms, because yes, he did create them. But like I mentioned prior, the collective unconscious isn't something we're really going to be considering, and even at the time of its proposal, it wasn't really agreed with. It implies that humans don't really evolve emotionally, and that people, at least from a personality standpoint, remain stagnant throughout their life and have principles hardwired into the psyche starting at birth. Putting aside the fact that most would agree this just isn't the case, it doesn't apply to FNAF's story. As much as people might argue the characterization in FNAF sucks, the characters that we follow throughout the story do have character arcs that see them change even in minor ways. Before we get to the specifics of this theory, I want to cover a few other things from Carl Jung, such as the self, individuation, and the concept of the shadow. Now, there's a few other things and terms that might be thrown around, but the basis of my theory today is going to involve these three concepts alongside what we've already talked about so far. In the simplest way possible, the self is the totality of one's psyche, all the processes, all the components, all the aspects of our personality. It represents a unified bridge between the consciousness and the unconsciousness. The main point of oneself is to be whole. For example, imagine a puzzle with a lot of pieces. The goal of a puzzle is to, of course, put all the pieces together so that the puzzle is whole. When oneself is whole, then fulfillment has been achieved. However, the completion of one's total self can only happen through the process of individuation. Individuation is essentially the process of which different aspects of who you are come together to form your independent and distinct self. You may or may not have heard the term self-realization before. Self-realization is when someone essentially finds their purpose or meaning in life. Individuation is basically just another way of saying that. You might remember when I mentioned universal archetypes, and that under Carl Jung's model they basically make up a person's personality. It's important to note that Carl Jung did believe that there was variety in people's personalities, via the idea that these archetypes he spoke of could and would overlap, which in turn created new archetypes. Now, although we already said we're mostly doing away with the collective unconsciousness, what I'm talking about now does play into the process of individuation, where, again, under Carl Jung's model, aspects of one's personality, which we mentioned is made up of archetypes, combine to help us self-actualize. However, it's obviously easier said than done, and as I said before, humans are flawed and can have issues that, put simply, can make them unstable. A big part of this entire endeavor is the conscious and unconscious mind. There has to be synergy and unity between the two in order for us to achieve the concept of self. If the bridge between the two is rocky, let's say, or if there's disharmony or disconnection between them, that could lead to psychological problems, which, in turn, could hinder your self-realization. Now we get to the concept of shadow psychology. Now, when you hear the word shadow, you might think of a few things, perhaps the shadow you most likely see in everyday life, aka your own literal shadow. You know, that thing that you cast that's dark because you are physically shielding away light from wherever you're standing. Black is, after all, the absence of light. However, in psychology, there is another meaning for the concept of a shadow. The shadow is a concept that resides within the confines of the personal unconscious, with ties to the collective unconscious and, oddly enough, is even accessible by the conscious mind. The shadow is, for all intents and purposes, the opposite of something called the persona. While one's persona helps them adapt to different social scenarios on a daily basis, the shadow consists of what might be deemed unacceptable by the ego. For some context, the concept of the persona is basically a mask. Actually, it's derived from the masks Greek actors used to wear. The persona or mask that we wear is what we publicly show to the world. A persona should be able to adapt to different social environments and situations. However, it is possible for people to be unable to, let's say, shake off a persona. A good example is a teacher in primary school that, even outside of work, will treat other people, including adults, as if they're still teaching class. This might not seem like an apparent issue on the surface, surface, but it does mean that other qualities of a person's personality remain as untapped potential, which isn't good for the process of individuation, and therefore, the individual might become impoverished. As we grow up, starting from childhood, the persona is supposed to grow with us in order to adapt to, as I said before, different circumstances and situations, as well as adhere to expectations set upon us by figures of authority. Assuming that, in a general sense, parents teach their kids good manners, good behavior, common decency, etc., that might play into a persona. For example, a mother or father might instruct you to behave during a holiday family gathering, so instead of roughhousing or being wild, you're calm and collected and polite. With that in mind, you might have heard the concept in the past about how what we see and hear from our parents in our early years will ultimately affect how we act and are in our adult years. If the persona is supposed to carry traits that are acceptable or desirable, then the undesirable traits that the ego deems unnecessary or unacceptable are left to feed the shadow. Yes, I know, I already said this before, but it's important to know that the shadow and persona both coincide with one another fairly closely. It's very much in the vein of balance, so to speak. Light and dark, good and evil, sweet tea and unsweetened tea. The shadow and persona are opposites, yet both are required to exist because they are in a compensatory relationship with one another. If the bridge between these two systems broke, it could lead to a lacking personality and mental instability involving self-doubt, paranoia, and all-around insecurity. Although the concept of the shadow might sound inherently bad for our psyche, it gives our personalities depth and a place to realize and recall what is morally, emotionally, and socially unacceptable in daily routine life. But we're not quite done talking about this concept just yet, because I want to focus in on this concept of the shadow holding negative or bad aspects that an individual might not want to identify as part of oneself. That said, it's important to note that the shadow doesn't necessarily only retain bad aspects per se, because not every person's persona is necessarily wholly acceptable or good. The shadow is the opposite of the persona, and so if someone's persona has arguably bad qualities, then the shadow will reflect good qualities. I want to also point out that the shadow doesn't just reflect opposites, but it also contains aspects and truths that our conscious mind can't admit about itself. This is where some of that darkness might come into play. The darker and ruder thoughts one might have every so often because they simply slip by. Things that we know for a fact might be morally or socially wrong, yet the thoughts have still crossed our minds. Okay, so how the hell am I going to tie this all back to Five Nights at Freddy's? How does this tie back to the Shadow Animatronics and the crying child? God knows that was a lot of yip yap, and if you've made it this far into the video, number one, I applaud you, and number two, thank you very much. I assure you there was a reason for all that yapping, even if some of it was just context or clarification to help explain other systems in Carl Jung's model. Finally, let's talk about the crying child. To set our basis of facts, let's jot down what we can definitely say about this kid. Number 1, he has an immense fear regarding the animatronics. Although he likes the Freddy's characters themselves, hence the plushies in his room, he is terribly afraid of the robotic machines at the actual restaurants. Number 2, he refers to the Freddy's characters as his friends, despite his fear of the animatronics. Number 3, his older brother Michael terrorizes him on a daily basis. We often see Michael wearing a Foxy mask as he jumps out and scares the crying child. Number 4, considering the lack of a visible parental figure in all of FNAF 4's minigames, we can infer that neither Afton nor a Mrs. Afton seems to be routinely present. Number 5, last but not least, this child died on his birthday when Michael, alongside his other friends, carried the crying child to the stage in Fredbear's family diner, then proceeded to shove him into the mouth of Fredbear. Now, some might add a thing or two to that list, but those 5 things are basically what I'm most confident in saying are legitimate fact. This is what we see in the game, and these are the most obvious aspects that you can derive from the game's narrative. Going back to the concept of one's self, more specifically the unity that is supposed to exist between the conscious and unconscious mind, I mentioned before that if there is instability between those two things, then that can create issues and stunt your self-realization, or more accurately, cause psychological problems. But psychological problems can also be created via traumatic experiences that humans endure. By extension, mental issues that we may develop via trauma we experience could impact the connection between the conscious and unconscious mind. Now already there's a few things to point out. For starters, the crying child is nowhere near adulthood, and the process of individuation involves you growing up and becoming your distinct self. This kid is not even a teenager. We don't know his actual age, but we know he's younger than Michael at the very least. However, that aspect doesn't actually matter. Of course, the crying child would be unable to achieve Carl Jung's concept of self. He's a child. That doesn't mean the trauma and torment he's suffering from wouldn't impact his psyche though. It just means that if he had ever gotten close to adulthood, he'd probably have a lot of trouble completing the process of individuation because of his rough childhood. Remember that the ego is another way of saying the conscious mind. To reiterate, the ego consists of things we are constantly and consistently aware of. Again, our thoughts and our feelings. This poor kid is constantly and consistently in psychological pain because of his fear being used against him by his older brother, and the lack of an effective parental figure in his life. With that, we're actually going to kill off the crying child, then jump over to the Shadow Animatronics. God knows I've talked about what these fellas are in numerous other videos, so if you want a bit more of an accurate and detailed breakdown of them, I suggest checking out one of my other theories. But to boil it down, I do wholeheartedly believe that the Shadow Animatronics were born or created from the agony surrounding certain events in the series. Now, depending on who you ask, these certain events might differ. In the past, I deposited that RXQ and Shadow Freddy could have come from the agony of the MCI and DCI. However, I'd also be willing to believe they could have come from the agony of the Crying Child and Charlie's deaths. There was also the interpretation that both characters solely came from the Crying Child's death instead of two different occasions. Oddly enough, it's that final option we're going to be going with for this discussion. So yes, let's say the Shadow Animatronics came from the agony of the Crying Child's death. That does make some sense when you consider the fact that the Crying Child, prior to his death, saw the purplish shadows of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie casting from the show stage. But how can we apply psychology to the shadows, especially considering that we've already landed on what they're created from? Well, let's focus on what we see these characters do across all their appearances. They don't really do much in their first appearance, that being FNaF 2. RXQ is basically this game's version of Golden Freddy from FNaF 1, and Shadow Freddy has a random chance of appearing in parts and service. However, in FNaF 3, we see Shadow Bonnie and Shadow Freddy with a little bit more of an active role. Shadow Freddy lures the classic animatronics to the safe room, causing them to have an error because they aren't allowed to access the safe room. This allows William Afton to pop out and dismantle them one by one. We see Shadow Bonnie in one of the Happiest Day minigames where he gives a cake to one of the lost souls. This in turn helps out with getting the good ending of the game. It's widely theorized that Shadow Freddy technically has an appearance in FNaF 4 in the form of Nightmare. I've gone over this myself in the past. I won't be focusing on the deeper evidence and details here. But essentially, the theory is that, after working at FNaF 1, Michael is followed home by Shadow Freddy, and the Urple Bear is the reason Michael goes through FNaF 4's gameplay. In that regard, Shadow Freddy is definitely painted in a pretty antagonistic light so far. He helped William Afton dismantle the animatronics, and he's putting Mike through these nightmares very similar to that of William Afton's fear experiments. Or, if you believe the Crying Child had these nightmares too, Shadow Freddy would be putting Mike through what his younger brother suffered as well. Again, either way, Shadow Freddy is a big meanie. The next time we see RXQ, it's in FNaF Special Delivery, where he'll only appear if you collect too much Dark Remnant, which may or may not just be agony. Either way, he'll only attack you if that happens, and we see that this Dark Remnant tends to hover around the normal Remnant. In a sense, it's as if Shadow Bonnie here is just trying to stop us from collecting more Remnant, as if he were some sort of guardian for it. Considering what little we see from Shadow Bonnie, he feels more like an ally to the Lost Souls as opposed to Shadow Freddy, who seems to act against other characters. Two sides of the same coin, but both enacting different wills. Yet, if we go with the theory that they came from the same source, that being Crying Child's death, why are they on opposite sides of the spectrum? Well, remember how we talked about Carl Jung's concepts of the conscious and unconscious mind? How one's conscious ego represents their awareness, their rationality, and what they feel, in contrast to the unconscious ego which retains memories and experiences. All these different aspects of the psyche under Carl Jung's model are like puzzle pieces or components components that will work together or even in tandem. With that in mind, what if we looked at the Shadow Animatronics as if they were split aspects of the crying child's psyche, splinters of this poor, tormented child that represent different parts of his traumatized self? Now, I admit that this is all a little messy no matter how you look at it. That's because these characters were probably not intended to be looked at like this. However, I already put my disclaimer at the beginning of the video, so in any case, let's get a bit more specific. What if we said that Shadow Bonnie represented the crying child's conscious mind, while the unconscious mind is represented by Shadow Freddy? Bear in mind that the shadow, no, not those shadows, I mean the concept we talked about earlier, exists as an aspect within the unconscious mind. The shadow, as we mentioned, contains repressed and perhaps negative emotions that our conscious mind might choose to forget, or, if it's something morally indecent, choose to neglect. I think that would be most fitting for Shadow Freddy. He is definitely a more antagonistic force that acts with hostile intent. This is a smaller piece of evidence, but there's a scene in the week before that actually references the crying child's death via a weird phone call that Ralph can listen to. However, at the end of the phone call, Ralph meets a fatal end at the jaws of an animatronic, which, it's a little vague, but it's inferred he basically died in the same way the crying child did. Jaw meets cranium. You could also infer that the animatronic was probably Golden Freddy, which people have been taking as evidence for Golden Duo, the idea that both Cassidy and the crying child haunt Golden Freddy. I'm not getting into that, but I think something we could take away from it is that the crying child may not be the nicest bloke on the ghost block, which, to be fair, he definitely has his reasons for being pissed off like any other spirit in this hellhole. My point would be that it's not necessarily out of the realm of possibility that Shadow Freddy represents negative aspects of the crying child's psyche. This is a child who died young and was tormented by his own family, specifically his brother, which, when you consider the whole FNaF 4 Shadow Freddy following Mike home thing, yeah, you might derive from it that he's a little peeved. But if Shadow Freddy contains that repression of violence, what about Shadow Bonnie? The easy answer would be that Shadow Bonnie contains conscious aspects of the crying child's psyche that abide by more traditional and moral standards. However, I don't think that would necessarily be accurate. I already said it before, but just because the persona and shadow are reflective of one another doesn't quite mean that the shadow automatically contains everything bad about someone. Think about it this way. If Shadow Bonnie was just supposed to be everything good about the crying child, well, the crying child was a pretty big baby. We aren't certain what crying child's persona would be beyond what we see in FNaF 4. Even then, a persona is, for all intents and purposes, a social mask. What we see in FNaF 4 isn't a child acting socially adaptable in different environments. This is a child going through immense emotional suffering to the point of breaking down. Working off of that, we don't even know what morals the crying child would have been taught. We already know that William isn't exactly the most existing of parents, and we know next to nothing about his wife. If we work simply off of the idea that the persona and shadow are opposites, that doesn't really make sense for what Shadow Bonnie would represent under this whole idea. Okay then, case closed. I'm an idiot and this really was pointless. Well, not exactly. You see, there's a difference between Shadow Freddy being antagonistic and Shadow Bonnie being moderately less so. RXQ is still a hostile threat, specifically in FNaF AR. The difference there is that you basically need to provoke him in order to incur his wrath. We could also say that he may or may not kill the player in FNaF 2 when he appears, but that's a little bit more vague because he just crashes your game instead of jump scaring you. Either way, remember what Crying Child said about the plushies in his bedroom in the very first minigame from FNaF 4? These are my friends. That's what he said. Shadow Bonnie serves as an ally to the other children because the Crying Child sees the Freddy's characters as his friends. The Crying Child may not have a functioning persona, and there is most likely disunity between his conscious mind and his unconscious mind, but there are aspects to him that Shadow Bonnie might still represent, that being the love and care he might have for the only things he called his friends. If you're aware of what Shadow Victim and Memory Victim are, this might not sound too far-fetched actually, because it's heavily theorized the Crying Child does have an actual connection to these characters and, by extension, the souls that reside in them. It's a whole thing. Again, not going into it here, but I have done so in a previous video. Okay, that's enough shameless plugging for now. Before we tie it up here, I want to tidy up some stuff and focus on some things I more or less glossed over. For starters, I want to point out the moral ambiguity that the crying child may have. The crying child is, at the end of the day, a tragic victim. It's not exactly reasonable to expect him to actually be some sort of heart of gold kid when his childhood was so traumatizing. That doesn't make the crying child a bad kid by any means. He just never had a proper parental figure to more accurately teach him right from wrong. Granted, this is assuming that Afton really wasn't around much, but to be fair, we only ever see Michael and the crying child interact in FNaF 4. However, we do see Afton working at Fredbear's family diner during the game. However, the fact that Shadow Freddy may possibly be an ally to Afton also makes a lick of sense when you think about how his two other children, Michael and Elizabeth, are either subservient or at one point were subservient to their father. At the end of the day, the crying child is just another tool for William, a means to learn more about the paranormal and supernatural, hence the fear experiments we see in Dittophobia. Although William wasn't a very active father, he still was the crying child's dad. The reason Shadow Freddy helps him might be because the aspect of the crying child that sees Afton as an authority figure is part of Shadow Freddy. However, admittedly, that's conjecture, and I don't really think it matters anyway. The other thing I want to mention is the personal unconsciousness again, and that idea that it retains forgotten/stored memories. One of the big gists about theories that have to do with the crying child being put back together through whatever spiritual means is the idea of his memories. This is generally stuff that we see in FNaF 4 that somehow ties back to previous games, the most infamous and obvious one being Toichika's beak. I mean, it sort of explains itself, right? Bringing together forgotten memories from his past to help free the crying child. In a way, you could even compare it to self-actualization. By bringing together the lost pieces of the crying child's soul and memory, you're repairing his fractured psyche in order to give him peace. I know I said earlier that we wouldn't really be focusing on it, but if you want, you can even bring the collective unconscious into it. If you want to run with the idea of characters having a blueprint of sorts within them since birth, then technically speaking, the crying child might have a personality that just never got to blossom because of his tortured experiences and his death. That also plays into the concept of a vacant persona. By not being able to explore these facets of oneself, you're unable to achieve an efficient self and you'll be unable to adapt to different social circumstances. Once again, the crying child is just that, a child. Realistically, he wouldn't be anywhere close to achieving the process of individuation. But again, if we say that personality blueprint exists, hopefully you get the idea. Okay, so this will actually probably end up being a pretty long video. As of writing this script, I have just begun the 17th page, making this my longest script yet, I think. Hopefully the hard work pays off, although I wouldn't be surprised if people ended up clicking off within the first few minutes of the beginning. But that's okay, because for those of you who have made it to the end, I thank you wholly. This video wasn't made with the intention of being groundbreaking. This isn't even something I'd seriously consider while doing an actual theory. This was just me being silly and looking at this topic through a slightly different pair of lenses, which, ironically, I actually did recently get new glasses finally. Now I can see Freddy Fazbear's Fazballs in ultra high def. In any case, I hope you at least enjoyed the video a tiny bit. It was really fun to do, definitely a different sort of research than what I'm used to. Suffice to say, I never thought I'd actually bring real life psychology into a theory, but hey, there's a first for everything. I'm not sure if it's something I'd necessarily do again. It would definitely depend on the topic and what comes to mind. However, I definitely be interested in doing character breakdowns of characters like Michael, William, Vanessa, and so on and so forth. If that's something you'd be interested in, feel free to comment down below. Perhaps even leave a like if you're feeling gracious. Or if you're really in the mood, you can even smack that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell. Feel free to also join my Discord server. It's where I post updates as to what I'm up to, and it's also where I post notifications in regards to when I'm streaming. We tend to play FNaF games games and other fun stuff like Roblox, Minecraft, horror games, etc. If that's something you'd be interested in seeing or even joining, we'd love to have you. With that all out of the way, thank you so much for watching, and once again, I hope you enjoyed the video. I also hope you have a good day or a good night, whichever it is for you. Either way, I will see you all next time. Peace out. I actually did recently get new glasses finally. Now I can see Freddy Fazbear's 5 balls. Wait. Now I can see Freddy Fazbear's Fazballs in the ultra. Now I can see Freddy Fazbear's. Fuck. Now I can. This is really difficult. Now I can see Freddy Fazbear's Fazballs in ultra high def.